Hello, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to Belial's Tea House. I had a conversation recently with some people, and it was a family member. Just having a general conversation. They asked me my opinion, and Donnie, who's a individual who just won the Democratic primary for the mayoral race in New York City, which is a bit strange because I am not from New York City and very far away, at the very least. Um, my relatives usually don't ask my opinion on things, and they asked me. I do read a lot, and they asked me simply my political opinion on the individual itself himself. Um, Really, I think based off of what I've heard from people I know who live in the city itself, that he may be actually good for the city. But it was interesting to have the conversation, really, because the thing that I took away from the conversation actually was this fear that people have of change in American politics, but also this idea that if something is not affecting you, then it's not a big deal. And I feel that that's a running theme when it comes to discussing politics of anybody in America. That if it doesn't affect them personally, they don't really feel like it's an issue at all. What I mean by that is my family members or the individuals I was speaking with often have this kind of insulated idea of what's going on in the country. Um, it comes down to the discussion about eminent domain. And Donnie apparently wants to redistribute some housing in New York City. At least I'm vaguely familiar with it. But it came down to this fear that they had of perhaps government doing that to other people. But that's already been done. In my own city, there's actually a development from a university that used to be a prominent working class neighborhood that has since, of course, been demolished for the new complex for said university. In fact, in cities in America, there are entire neighborhoods that have been destroyed to build highways, or they have been entirely remodeled and had highways built on top of them. This has been a very common thing in American history, actually. If you go to New York City itself, which again I'm not from, but I do love American history, Grand Central Station was built on top of an Irish shanty town, and New York City's most prominent park, Grand Central Park, was actually built on top of a black neighborhood that was one of the few places where African Americans could build communities in New York City. There is, of course, a huge history of the quote unquote black neighborhood being moved in New York City over and over again. And Malcolm X talks about this in his book, actually. Not the only place that is talked about, but in his autobiography, as told by Alex Haley, he does bring up how Harlem is not even the original quote unquote African American neighborhood, although it is now historically significant to that community. What I come down to think of this is that often these things people are worried about happening have already happened to some other group or community, or even people within their own communities, but people are just unaware and become insulated, which is probably a consequence of white flight and the suburban experience, where you're disconnected from the rest of society almost in an insulated bubble, far away from the actual problems that affect the majority of people in the country. And this is not to say that I'm talking down to any of my relatives. In fact, I love them very much, and they've worked very hard to get where they are. But it's the disconnection Americans have with one another, I would say. There's almost no sense of community. We get up and we go to work. Some of us work from home. Some of us work in warehouses or in offices, but we don't communicate with one another, especially in my city, where People often don't even go out for large portions of the time due to the weather. But I would say that this disconnect we have of our own communities is a consequence of a hyper individualist society. Now, there's nothing wrong with individualism at all. In fact, speaking with my friends who come from very collectivist societies, I would say American individualism is actually very good in some regard. However, hyper individualism, anything taken to an extreme, is a negative for society. What I mean by this is people have lost that sense of community, and there's a lot of talk about third spaces among people, a place to go, just to be among your community and feel like you're part of something. Now, personally, I do have places I do go to, and if I don't go to them often enough, I do feel myself feeling disconnected and not tuned in to my community and feeling isolated. I do go to Juma prayer at least, well, once a week. I'd say I'd go to Juma prayer, which is common. That's the normal. Don't know why I was going to say at least once a week. Of course, you go to Juma once a week. But also, I do frequent local coffee shops. I very much like being around people in my area, and I've had some wonderful conversations with people of all walks of life, and I have met people. I've discussed philosophy and theology and just day-to-day goings on in our city. But people often feel disconnected in this society, and maybe that ties into this quote loneliness epidemic. I don't know if it's just a male loneliness thing. I believe that people are fundamentally isolated in this hyper individualist society where due to how we live, people just have no purpose and they have no reason to be around others. And I think maybe it's different in other communities, but growing up around white people, European, Euro-Americans, Caucasians, whatever you want to say about us, I think that's where it started, but it slowly crept into, I think, other communities, although I can't really speak on that. But everybody is just angry and isolated, and nobody feels like they owe their fellow man in something in society. Nobody feels like others have rights onto them. And personally, I do believe that it is our duty as citizens and as people living on this planet to help our fellow man, to be there for somebody. You can't always do that. Sometimes you do have to draw a line. It's not like you can give all of your money away, but just the idea of at least listening to people, at least being involved some way and realizing you are not an island onto yourself. There are other people in this country, and everything we do has a cause and effect. What I mean by this is that this toxic idea that I've got mine, so I don't need to worry about others, or pulling up the ladder as you get to the second floor, it's not healthy for society. We are seeing, I believe, to be the fruits of the new neoliberal normal that started in the 80s, I would say. We got rid of manufacturing. We got rid of all of these, quote, not really low skill jobs, but jobs people could have. And maybe they're not the most complex, but people could have a job and they could raise a family and they could afford things. But now we just have no community. There's just the service industry is essentially what most people do in the United States. But that doesn't tie into what I mean about community. What I mean about community is that the social revolution that happened in this country pretty much destroyed any facet of normality we had in a community. And I'm not talking about, socially conservative values. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that there was this sense that people belong somewhere. And now people have become interchangeable parts in a machine. And you're not treated as a human being. And getting back to Mandani, what I would say about that is the conversation turned to speaking about people who are wealthy in general. And the problem that I personally have with wealth is not that someone is wealthy. Mindani does come from a somewhat privileged background. I'm not saying that he hasn't struggled, but he does come from a pretty well-off family. But it came down to the current president speaking of rich people are wealthy individuals. And I had to tell them, my problem isn't with wealthy individuals. You can be for a better society and not necessarily have to be from the lowest portion of that society. Now, he did have his problems, of course, but Henry Ford famously fought against the idea that a corporation's only responsibility was to ensuring its shareholders had increasing profits. That's one thing I would say, looking at any individual who is blessed with this amount of wealth, is to help society in some way. And he wasn't perfect. I'm not saying he was perfect at all. Of course, that's a discussion we can have for another day. But that's the idea that society, we are individuals in society, yes, but we are part of it, and we aren't meant to be selfish. Greed is not good. We need to uplift each other and to create a more healthy society moving forward into the future. And I feel like we haven't had a generation that wanted to do that since the greatest generation themselves. Not to get into generational things, but I believe that personally, the baby boomer generation, not to harp on them too much, became the generation, as George Carlin said, of I've got mine, and I give it to me, it's mine. And that slowly, I believe, is being broken, and it honestly is bringing Generation Z, the youngest generation, to some pretty dark places. You see the rise of more fringe political beliefs because people are lost and they need some kind of thing to make them feel like they're part of something, or make them feel like there's something I can do about this broken society. Because really, we are a broken society, a society of angry people where people just don't want to help. They don't want to be kind to one another. And they're always looking for someone to blame, someone to push down on, someone to find that can say, this is the reason society is like this. And I believe that every individual in our society has or can become better. At least that's my belief. And again, I'm not harping on the baby boomers. I just believe that there was a cultural shift in their youth that led us to where we are now. And perhaps it's the excess. We won the Second World War. With the help of our allies, the Soviets and the British, we won the war against the Axis. And with that came a boom in prosperity. We had everything we wanted, a consumer culture, and the greatest generation wanted to provide their children with something that they didn't have. But now we're living in the consequences of the materialism that good-intentioned thought process brought. And now we are disconnected, and people are living in a bubble that they don't believe that they owe their fellow man anything, and that you should just pull yourself up from your bootstraps. Sometimes people do need a helping hand. To quote Senator Huey Long, if you've ever been to a barbecue, what would you say if a man took 9/10 of the food that was meant for everybody there? The only good thing you would say is to have that man bring back the grub that he doesn't have any business with. Of course, my great-grandfather was a huge fan of Senator Long, and he had his own journey when it comes to solidarity and political discourse. But this is all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for listening if you've made it this far, and I wish you the best. This has been our little discussion in Belial's Tea House. Thank you.